Hello lovely people, welcome to another episode of Book Chat, the weekly roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past. I have a bunch of books to talk about this time. I'm just gonna dive in.
Sophie Vlogs.
I'm gonna kick things off with Hild by Nicola Griffiths. This book is set in about 7th century Anglo-Saxon England. We're primarily based in Wessex. We're following Hild. Hild is a person who did really exist, but this is a fictionalized account of her life. I've been really enjoying getting back into historical fiction, but also exploring historical fiction of areas that I haven't really read about before. I know a bunch of stuff about Anglo-Saxon history. I did like an Old English module at university, that sort of thing. One thing that I will say is a huge strength of this book is just the sheer, detailed world building that you get. This was a very slow book in many ways, plot-wise, and I think that makes sense because it is based on a real person's life. Plot-wise, sometimes it lacked for me a real drive of where are we going with this plot? But what it lacked in that, it absolutely was overflowing with so many world details. From all details, from both what was the politics of the time, what was people's daily lives, where would you have been living, what would you have been eating, what would the world have been like. That felt so clear to me, and it really came across really strongly. So that was, at times, it was lovely just to immerse myself and read this and just be what's it like? What is this world like? La la la. There are a number of moments in this where the stories and tales that people would tell in evenings and bars and stuff like that were talked about, and because I did do some Old English literature at university, stuff when they're referencing stuff like The Wanderer and stuff like that, I picked up on those references because I was I've read these texts, I understand what's really talking about here and stuff. So my favourite thing about this was very much this immersive world building. As I said, sometimes the plot wasn't quite driving enough for me, but I also think that might be the time that I read this. I read this during very stressful first week of isolation, just to give you a heads up of how back filmed my book chats are. This is my first week of isolation reading that I'm talking about now. So, partly I think maybe my occasional wish to have a slightly faster driving plot was partly just because I wanted to really take my mind off some stuff, and occasionally the more slower plodding route just it wasn't quite what I needed. But I do think this is a really good book. It also has some female rep in it. If I was to assign a modern sexuality to this, there appears to be a character who appears to be bisexual, but also I don't know historically if that's true, or narratively if that's the intent. I don't really know, but there's some rap going on is what I'm saying. But yeah, on the whole, I'm really glad I read this. It was really interesting, and I've never read anything like it, which I really enjoyed. I'd be interested to see what Nicola Griffiths' other work is like. She seems like she's really good with historical detail and stuff like that, so I'd be interested to see what else she has done. Just to jump to some non-fiction, something which is kind of related to that is I also read Celtic Saints of Wessex by Reeves. This is a really tiny little non-fiction book that's just essentially a little info pamphlet on Celtic Saints of Wessex. Again, I'm interested in Anglo-Saxon sort of time history. I'm interested in a lot of history, to be fair, but this was just sort of a little pamphlet of where I live would be within the Kingdom of Wessex if we were back in the day. So a lot of this was talking about places that I know quite well, and that was really interesting. So if you're a person who wants to be vaguely more familiar with stuff like Saints and Wessex and stuff, this is just a really good little pamphlet to read on that note, which was fun. Jumping back into some fiction, I read a book on my Kindle that was My Sister the Serial Killer. I've forgotten who it's written by. I'm going to put that detail in the description down below. Should have prepped that bit. But I read this book for my book club. My work has a book club where each month we read a different book and we talk about it. This one was a very popular book. A lot of people really enjoyed it. I think I read the whole thing in a day. It was very much it's about 200 and something pages, and it was very easy to just sit down and read it and get through it, which was fun. I also really enjoyed the discussions we had in book club. This is about a girl whose sister keeps killing men. And she keeps helping clean it up. And she's is my sister a serial killer? Is it all self-defense? Essentially, one thing that we talked about a lot in book club is how we felt about the characters. So there were some people in my book club who really sympathised with our narrator and stuff. I am a mistrustful reader. So if I'm reading a book that is coming from me from first person, from one person's perspective, especially a book that is concerned with violence and that sort of thing, I am inherently mistrustful of my narrator. So I had a slightly more complicated feeling towards her of both like having some sympathy, but also the thing that I think a lot of us found very interesting about this book was this quite codependent relationship between these sisters and the way that the boundaries between them kind of blurs. And it's like, it's not like this is mine, this is yours. It's like they're constantly like, this one's after these sorts of things of this one's life, and this one's after these sorts of things of this one's life, and that sort of thing. And then also like the roles that both of them play, like how complicit are both of them, how whose word do you trust? Everything that you're getting is coming from this person, so of course you feel sympathy for this person, but then as more details are revealed as you continue to read that, like how does that change how you're reading, stuff like that. So we had some really great discussions in book club about like that sort of stuff. I do think it was a really good book for book club. It's not my favourite book that I've ever read, but I had a really fun time discussing it with people in a group. Back onto some non-fiction, I also read Brew, Britannia, The Strange Rebirth of British Beer by Jessica Boak and Ray Bailey. This is a book all about the history of British beer, and specifically the history of British brewing. I don't really like beer. I have recently started to get into some fruit lambic beers, so like Creek Boone, stuff like that. If it's reminiscent of a fruity cider, I can get on board, because I am from the West Country. I hate ciders in my blood. So that's my way into beer. I was supposed to go to a beer festival, but it's been cancelled, obviously. Rescheduled, so I will be going eventually. But I find one of my favourite podcasts is Gastropod, which is all about the history and science behind food, and they did an episode on beer and brewing. It was really interesting, and my partner, who is really into beer, really enjoyed that episode and then lent me this. So this was interesting. I felt like this did a very good job of being quite a balanced, just overall look, because a lot of this is to do with CAMRA, which is a campaign about preserving real ale, but then some of the other groups that also arose. I think it does quite a good job of paying credit to people and organisations and stuff that had good roles to play, but then also identifying perhaps where the limits of those organisations are and that sort of thing. And also that there's more complexity than just like real ale good, other types of beer bad, because there are so many other types of beer now, and like what's the difference between craft beer and real ale? What's the difference between like cask and keg? All this stuff. I have learned a lot of stuff about beer, and I think it says something that I found this book really interesting, despite the fact that I actually don't really like drinking beer. I like eating stuff that has beer cooked with it. That's a good thing. But no, I think if you're someone who's interested in like the history of food, or is like very into beer, this is very good. It is very specifically based around Britain and British beers, but it was particularly interesting. But it does actually focus on the influence of other beers, other culture beers on British brewing. So like specifically like Belgian beer, Japanese beer, and then very much so like American beer and American brewing and that sort of stuff, and people who learned about one, came back, affected the other, that sort of thing. I just find food history really interesting, and especially the way that it ties into other political developments and stuff like that. So this was also really fun. I had a really good time reading it. That's everything I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, have you read any of these? Do you have any thoughts on any of them? I would love to hear anything you have to say in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you're having a really lovely day, and I will see you next time for something different.